Imagine you're reading a history book and buried inside it, the author accidentally tells you they're writing from the future. And they say things like, back when the Canaanites were still in the land, implying the Canaanites are gone now, or, and that's why people do such and such to this day, revealing they're looking back from a much later time. These aren't mistakes, they're fingerprints, and a German scholar named Martin Noth used them to crack one of the biggest puzzles in biblical studies. How these scholars figure this out? It starts with what's inside the text. First and Second Kings cover the history of Israel from David's death to the Babylonian exile in 587 BCE. The books explicitly name their sources: the Book of the Acts of Solomon, the Annals of the Kings of Israel, and the Annals of the Kings of Judah. And these were royal court records, the kind of administrative logs common across the ancient Near East. The text tells you where it got its information, but the sources aren't all the same type. The first 16 chapters of 1 Kings have a dry annalistic feel. Annalistic means list-like record-keeping, king names, reign lengths, brief event summaries. Then at 1 Kings chapter 17, the style shifts dramatically to vivid prophetic narratives about Elijah and Elisha. These were likely independent oral traditions about local heroes, later embedded into the larger framework. Different sources, different styles. So who wove them together and why? That's where Martin Noth comes in. In 1943, Noth made a groundbreaking argument. Deuteronomy has more in common with what follows it, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, than with what precedes it, Genesis through Numbers. These books should be read as a single literary history, which scholars now call the Deuteronomistic History. Since the narrative includes the Babylonian exile of 587 BCE, the final form must have been produced after that event. Deuteronomy serves as the theological introduction, and everything through 2 Kings unfolds as one continuous story. This wasn't a random anthology. It was a deliberate historical argument shaped by one editorial perspective. But how do you prove a single editorial hand shaped all of this? You need a method. Enter redaction criticism, the study of how an editor shaped a text's final form. It emerged from frustration with earlier methods. Source criticism separated texts into original written documents. Form criticism identified oral genres like hymns and legends. Tradition criticism traced how traditions evolved over time. All three methods kept breaking the text apart into smaller and smaller pieces, but none of them asked, what was the editor trying to do with all this material? Redaction criticism flips the question. Instead of looking through the text to find all the layers, it looks at the text's final shape to find the editor's purpose. It doesn't replace the earlier methods, it builds on them. So what does the editor's hand look like? Let's examine the fingerprints. Scholars identify 5 types of passages that betray the redactor, the editor or editorial school responsible for the final text. Each type reveals someone standing outside the raw source material, shaping it, connecting it, and interpreting it for an audience. When you collect all these passages and lay them side by side, they share the same vocabulary, the same rhetorical patterns, the same theological worldview. First, linking passages. These are transitional sentences that smooth the seams between different source materials, bridging from a dry king list to a vivid Elijah story. Second, interpretive comments. The editor steps back to explain why something happened, imposing a theological lens on raw historical data. Third, direct audience addresses. The text says, that was when the Canaanites were still in the land, speaking directly to readers and revealing a temporal gap between the events described and the time of writing. Fourth, etiological notes, passages explaining the origin of a current practice, and that is why the Israelites do such and such to this day. That phrase, to this day is a dead giveaway. The editor is explaining their own present by linking it to the past. Fifth, retrospective summaries, extended passages that pause the narrative to look back over a stretch of history and interpret it. The prime example is 2 Kings chapter 17. In 722 BCE, Assyria conquered the northern kingdom of Israel. That's the historical event. 2 Kings 17 pauses the entire narrative to deliver a theological sermon explaining why Israel fell. The editor lists the charges. Israel sinned against their God. They worshipped other gods. They ignored the prophets. Therefore, God removed them from the land. The editor doesn't just report. The editor explains. That's redaction criticism in action. The Deuteronomistic history isn't just an academic curiosity. This editorial framework gave the exiled Israelites something extraordinary, a narrative explanation for catastrophe. The exile wasn't random or meaningless. It was the consequence of covenant unfaithfulness, which meant it could be reversed through repentance, that the Hebrews did not fade into oblivion after losing political independence and their geographical homeland, is due in a large part to this interpretive framework. Now you know what to look for. Next time you read a biblical narrative, ask 3 questions. Where are the themes? Where does the style or source type suddenly shift? Who's talking to me? Where does the text break the fourth wall to address you directly or explain something to this day? And what's the frame? What theological interpretation is being imposed on the raw events? Redaction criticism taught scholars to stop looking past the editor and start looking for the editor. And when they did, they found one of the most ambitious literary projects in the ancient world. A single school that turns centuries of scattered records into a unified theological history of an entire people.